When my husband died, I thought grief would be the hardest part. But that was before his millionaire boss called and told me my life might be in danger. Mrs. Reed, he said, his voice calm but trembling underneath, please come to my office right away. Don't tell your son or daughter-in-law, and whatever you do, don't mention this call to anyone. My heart dropped. I remember gripping the phone tighter, staring at the empty seat across the breakfast table where my husband, Owen, used to sit. It had been only 4 days since his funeral, and now this? The whole world felt like it was tilting sideways. Follow my story until the end and comment from what city you are viewing me from. That way I can see how far my story has traveled. Owen had died suddenly, a heart attack, they said. One minute he was making coffee and talking about repairing the garden fence, and the next I found him collapsed in the garage, wrench still in hand. He was gone before the ambulance arrived. We'd been married 42 years. He was my anchor, my rhythm, the man who noticed when I changed the curtains or when I was pretending to be fine. But after his death, everything changed, especially the way my son Michael and his wife Harper began to treat me. At the funeral, I might as well have been invisible. Harper, with her smooth voice and rehearsed sympathy, ran the whole event as if she were the widow instead of me. She controlled every detail, the flowers, the seating, even who spoke. Michael followed her lead like a well-trained shadow. When I tried to help, he touched my arm and said, "Mom, please, just let us handle it. You shouldn't have to deal with the stress." That tone. That soft, patronizing tone that made me feel small, like I was the fragile one. People came up to them, not me, offering condolences, shaking their hands, praising their strength. And when I overheard Harper whisper to a neighbor, "We're doing everything we can for her. She's not handling it well," something inside me cracked. Fragile, that word echoed in my head all night. Owen never saw me as fragile. To him, I was his equal, strong, stubborn, capable. But now, I felt like a ghost in my own home. After the burial, Harper insisted on hosting a lunch at my house. My house, the one Owen and I built together, the one I'd hoped to grow old in. I sat quietly in my favorite chair by the window, watching her order people around like a hostess in her own mansion. The sunlight touched the picture frames on the wall, wedding photos, family trips, and every one of them looked like a memory that didn't belong to me anymore. Harper handed me a cup of tea I didn't ask for. "You should rest, Alina," she said sweetly. "You've been through so much." Michael joined her, standing beside the fireplace. "Mom, we've been talking," he began cautiously, glancing at Harper. "We don't think it's safe for you to stay here alone. The house is too big. Maybe it's time to consider a community where you'll have people around." For a moment, I thought I'd misheard him. "A what?" I asked. "You know," Harper said quickly, "a retirement community. They're wonderful places full of activities and care. You'd have company all the time." "I'm not moving anywhere," I said, my voice trembling. "Alina," Michael replied gently, as if talking to a child, "we're only thinking of your safety." Safety. That word felt like a leash. I looked from my son to the woman who had somehow become the decision-maker of my life. And for the first time, I saw pity in their eyes, but beneath it, something sharper. Something like calculation. Later that night, when they finally left, I sat alone in the dark living room. Every tick of the clock sounded louder than usual. The house felt hollow without Owen, yet still full of him, his chair, his tools, his scent on the blanket we'd shared. Then the phone rang, an unfamiliar number. I hesitated but answered. "Mrs. Reed?" a man's voice said. "This is Henry Dalton. I worked with your husband at Dalton and Myers Investments." Of course, I knew the name. Owen had mentioned his boss many times, always with respect. "I'm very sorry for your loss," he continued. "Owen was a remarkable man." "Thank you," I murmured, not trusting my voice. There was a pause, then softly but firmly he said, "Mrs. Reed, I need to see you in person. There's something you need to know about the last few months of Owen's life." My hand tightened around the receiver. "What kind of thing?" I asked. "I can't explain over the phone. Please come to my office tomorrow at 10. And whatever you do, don't tell your son or daughter-in-law about this." Owen was very clear about that. Clear about that? I sat frozen. Owen had known something. He had left instructions. And for some reason, those instructions didn't include Michael or Harper. When I hung up, I just sat there staring at the dark window, my own reflection looking back at me, pale and trembling. For the first time since his death, I felt Owen's presence like a whisper saying, "Pay attention, Ellie. Don't let them fool you." The next morning, I woke up with a kind of determination I hadn't felt in years. Grief had weighed me down, but suspicion gave me strength. Michael called early, checking in like a warden. "Mom, how did you sleep? Harper and I thought maybe you should stay with us a few days." "I'm fine," I said, keeping my tone light. "Actually, I have to go out this morning." "Out where?" My mind raced. "The pharmacy. I ran out of my blood pressure pills." "I'll pick them up for you," he said quickly. "No," I replied, firmer now. "I can handle it, Michael." There was a long pause, then a sigh. "All right, Mom, just be careful." The drive downtown felt longer than usual. Dalton and Myers occupied one of those intimidating glass towers that make you feel small the moment you step inside. I walked through the lobby clutching my purse like armor. The receptionist directed me to the executive floor. Mr. Dalton's office was sleek, floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city, polished furniture, not a single paper out of place. He stood as I entered, tall, silver-haired, and composed, but with a shadow of worry behind his polite smile. "Mrs. Reed, thank you for coming," he said, offering a seat. "I know this isn't easy." I nodded, sitting across from him, my heart hammering. He took a deep breath, then opened a folder on his desk. Inside were pages, handwritten notes, printed forms, and what looked like photocopies of documents. "During the last few months of his life," he said slowly, "your husband came to me several times. He was concerned." "Concerned about what?" I asked. Mr. Dalton met my eyes. "About your son and daughter-in-law." My blood ran cold. "What about them?" "He believed they were trying to manipulate him into making changes to his will and your shared accounts. He said they wanted to secure legal control over your finances and possibly your medical decisions." I shook my head. "That's impossible. Michael wouldn't." He slid a photocopy toward me. It was a power of attorney form, partly filled out unsigned. At the bottom was Owen's name crossed out in blue pen. "He brought this to me," Mr. Dalton said. "He told me your son had pressured him to sign, saying it was for your protection. But Owen refused. That's when he started keeping records." I stared at the paper, my hands trembling. It was his handwriting, my husband's, and suddenly all those small things from the last year started clicking into place. The secretive phone calls, the quiet tension during dinners, the way Harper would say I was forgetful when I wasn't. "He also told me," Mr. Dalton continued carefully, "that Harper began hinting you might have early signs of memory loss. That she told both Owen and Michael you were getting confused, that maybe you needed supervision." My stomach turned. "That's a lie," I whispered. "I'm perfectly fine." "He knew that," Mr. Dalton said. "That's why he documented everything." He turned more pages, Owen's notes, dated entries, even transcripts of conversations. "Marissa mentioned retirement home again." Michael silent. "I think they've decided on a plan." The room began to spin. Owen had known, he'd seen this coming. I felt tears welling up, tears of betrayal, not grief. "Why didn't he tell me?" "He didn't want to scare you," Mr. Dalton said softly. "He hoped he was wrong, but he left instructions that if anything ever happened to him, I was to call you, privately." And then a knock on the door. Sharp, loud, sudden. Mr. Dalton froze. We both turned as the door opened, and my heart stopped. Michael and Harper stood in the doorway, their faces a mixture of surprise, anger, and something darker. "Mom," Michael said in a tone I'd never heard before. "What are you doing here?" The air in the room grew heavy. Harper's voice was sweet, but her eyes were cold. "We were so worried when we couldn't reach you." "Why didn't you tell us you were coming here?" I looked from them to the folder in front of me, then back to Mr. Dalton. Something told me this was only the beginning. They stood there in the doorway like storm clouds. Michael with his polite anger, Harper with the smile that never reached her eyes. For a beat, I tried to steady my breathing, hold the fragile thread of normality between us. But there was no normal left, not after the folder, not after the way Mr. Dalton had said their names. "Mom," Michael repeated, softer this time, but with steel. He stepped fully into the room as if he owned the space. "What are you doing here?" "You're interrupting a private conversation," Mr. Dalton said evenly. He closed the folder a little to protect whatever brittle piece still existed. "Perhaps you should wait outside." "I didn't come to make a scene," Harper said sweetly, but her hand rested near the crook of Michael's elbow like a co-conspirator. "We're worried about you. Frankly, everyone is." Worry. The word had become a weapon. I swallowed and felt anger flare hotter than grief. You don't get to decide that, I said. Not here, not like this. Michael's face tightened. He put on the voice he used when he wanted to win an argument without being cruel. Mom, you've been upset. We're only trying to keep you safe, I snapped. To keep me safe from what? From my own home, from my own life? Every syllable tasted like accusation. I had loved him 3 decades longer than he'd been an adult. The sting of that voiced betrayal was clean and bright. Harper's smile didn't falter. Eleanor, you know how confusing grief can be. You need support. I need my life, I said. Not your version of it. Mr. Dalton put his hands on the folder as if he could anchor the storm. Please, he said, sit, let us explain. They sat, but the chairs seemed to amplify the distance between us. Mr. Dalton opened the folder again and pulled out a sheaf of papers, photocopies, emails, a few printouts that looked like bank statements. He placed them in front of Michael slowly, like revealing evidence in a trial. There was no theatrics, no gavel, only a plain, clinical unspooling of the last months. These are copies of attempts to get legal control, Mr. Dalton said. There were phone calls, visits. Here are dates where your father pushed back. I watched Michael's face as the pages flipped, looking for the flicker of embarrassment or denial. Instead, he practiced surprise, the well-coached kind that insists innocence. This is out of context, he said at last. You're making assumptions. Is this your handwriting? Mr. Dalton asked, holding up a page written in my husband's slanted, economical script. Daniel's notes, precise as always, annotated with times, names, the shorthand he used when he wanted clarity. Here, note, pressuring to sign, POA unsigned, Mar 14. Marissa mention assisted living? Michael's throat bobbed. Harper's fingers curled around the rim of her coffee cup so hard the porcelain lined her knuckles. Look, he said, we were worried about Mom. That's different from trying to steal her home, Mr. Dalton supplied gently. From opening lines of credit in her name, from talking to a doctor about memory issues before any diagnosis. Silence pressed down. The air tasted like paper and something metallic, the kind of metallic taste fear leaves in your mouth. You don't have proof, Michael said, you have speculation. I felt small and immense at the same time. A species of fury rose that had nothing to do with losing my husband and everything to do with finding out I had been treated like a pawn. Daniel had documented it all in patient, heartbreaking detail. He'd been methodical because he trusted me too much to let them move unnoticed. You told him to stop, Mr. Dalton said. That's what these records show. One entry reads, refuse POA, feel pressured, E refuses to sign. Discussed with Henry, document. Henry Dalton, the man sitting across from us, lowered his voice. Your husband wanted you to know if anything happened. He was concerned about the way decisions were being framed as for your own good. Harper opened her mouth, then closed it. She looked like someone caught in a lie that had teeth. We only suggested options, she said. We aren't the ones. Suggested that she move out 2 days after the funeral, Mr. Dalton interrupted. Suggested handling her mail. You asked to take her mail for organization? Michael's mouth opened. He surged forward, the old son pride replacing the practiced calm. That's not theft, Mom, it's smart planning. Smart planning, the phrase bruised like a cheap shoe. You plan my life without me, I said. That's not planning, that's a takeover. Mr. Dalton folded his hands. There's more. He reached into the folder and pulled out a small digital recorder, a slim rectangle no larger than a candy bar. We had a private investigator look into rumors. He captured conversations. This one was recorded 3 weeks ago. My stomach dropped. Recordings, evidence you can't squirm out of. I felt both sick and relieved as he pressed play. Michael's voice filled the quiet office, casual and ordinary. We need to speed things up, he said on the tape. Dad's asking questions, Mom's not acting the way we hoped. Harper's voice, breathy and decisive, answered. I already spoke to the facility director. The doctor can sign something. It'll just be a formality if we do things right. The words landed like a hand on my chest. On the speaker, the tape continued. Michael. Once she's declared unfit, everything turns over. House, accounts. We handle it. We clean things up. Harper, it's not cruel. She'd be safer there. We can visit. She'll get the care she needs. Michael's husbandly tone on the recording, the one he used to justify decisions, was a mask. The act of hearing it, of watching their faces while the tape played, was profoundly unmooring. My knees felt weak. The folder's edges dug into my palms. When the tape ended, Harper's composure cracked for the first time. "That was out of context," she said in a voice that wobbled. "We never said you did," Mr. Dalton said quietly. "You said you'd paid a doctor to prepare a report." Michael's face flushed. He had the look of a man who had expected sympathy and instead encountered evidence. Irrefutable, blunt. "You paid a doctor?" I asked. The syllables were small, incredulous, as if confronted with something obscene. Harper swore softly, the practiced voice gone. "It was for paperwork, just in case. We didn't think it would come to this." "In case," I repeated. "In case you wanted to control my life and my finances?" Heaven no, I had tried to be open, to believe the best in my son. But now, with paper and a recording that smelled like betrayal, the illusion fell away. Daniel had seen this coming. He had prepared a net I hadn't known he was weaving. "Why didn't he tell me?" I asked Mr. Dalton, and the question that had festered since the first phone call came out raw. "He didn't want to frighten you," Henry said. "He hoped he was wrong. He wanted you to be yours, not someone else's burden." "Then tell me something else," I said, voice low. "Why did he ask you to call me and not Michael or Harper? What made him insist on secrecy?" Mr. Dalton's expression hardened in a way that seemed almost personal. "He trusted you to respond differently," he said. "He wanted you to have time to think without pressure. He wanted you to be able to choose with facts." His words settled over me like a thin armor. Choose with facts. I closed my fist around the edge of the chair and felt resolve come forward like tidewater. Michael stood up as if to argue, but his face was suddenly younger, like a child caught doing wrong. "You're making accusations," he said. "This isn't a court, you can't just—" "We can," Mr. Dalton said. "If necessary." And then the whole room, humming with the low static of a city that does not care about the private wars of family life, smelled faintly of something else. It was the way a door opens. The rustle that makes your bones know change is coming. We all looked toward the office's inner door, the one Mr. Dalton used for private entry to a small antechamber. For a second, nothing happened. Then the door opened, not with a footfall but with a sound I have known my entire life. A sound so ordinary that I almost missed it, the soft, deliberate clearing of a throat. A cough, but a particular one, the sort that belongs to a man who has been leaning over a greenhouse and gets grit in his chest from soil. My breath stopped. The hair at my neck prickled. Something in my bones rose like an alarm. The way the door moved, the slight shift in the light as if someone had stepped out from shadow to sun, it rearranged everything. Mr. Dalton looked like a man who had seen this before. Michael and Harper both went white. My pulse pounded in my ears. Then a silhouette filled the doorway. A man stepped across the threshold in slow, measured steps. He moved like the man who always folded his shirts a certain way, who planted tomatoes in his beds with the patient method of someone who tended small, living things. I couldn't breathe. The world narrowed to the angle of his shoulders, the set of his jaw. A memory, the scent of engine oil, coffee, and old books, swelled so vividly that my hands remembered where to go even before my mind could catch up. He hadn't been there 5 minutes before my knees gave out. I reached for the arm of the chair and felt the room tilt. The world blurred and then focused on the man in the doorway. He smiled, not at the circus of shocked faces, but at me. It was the gentlest thing. It was the smile that had said stay when the storms came. "Owen," I whispered, and the name hung in the air like a dare. For one heartbeat, the man said nothing. And then, in a voice that was soft and steady, he said, "Hello, Ellie." The sound of that name, my name, from his lips was like a bell. All the paper, all the recordings, all the legal forms shrank into a mote of dust. The world pivoted on a single fact I had not been prepared to accept. My husband, the man I had buried, was standing in Mr. Dalton's office. My mouth opened and a laugh or a sob escaped me. The room seemed to spin. Michael's expression collapsed into something raw and ugly. Harper's smile fell away like a mask. Mr. Dalton's hand went to his mouth as if he had bitten his own lip. The digital recorder lay on the desk and blinked a soft red light, its evidence still warm and undeniable. For a second, the practical systems that keep society from falling apart, lawyers, tapes, bank holds, felt absurd against the impossible fact of the man in the doorway. He stepped forward and the light caught the lines around his eyes. He looked at me as if we'd only been apart for coffee. "Wise," I managed the word a thin thread. He closed his eyes as if to hold a terrible thing back, then opened them, fierce and tired. Because I had to know who would keep you, he said. And then the world went silent long enough for my heart to break the sound. When his voice said my name, "Hello, Ellie," the room flipped like a coin. For a second I didn't know if I was awake or walking inside a fever dream. Owen stood there looking as if he'd stepped out of one of those old photographs where time forgets to move. His hands were calloused, the knuckles familiar, his hair had the same stubborn cowlick I'd loved. He smelled like the garage and tomato stems and the wood smoke of our evenings. That smell hit me harder than any proof. People at first were statues made of sudden noise. Michael's mouth sagged, Harper's eyes shone wet. Mr. Dalton's face immediately attempted to locate the correct set of reactions a businessman should have: shock, then composure, then action. None of them felt real to me, only Owen did. He crossed the room slowly and sat beside me like a man sliding into his favorite chair after a long day. He didn't apologize with flowers or a theater-worthy confession. He took my hand the way he always had, with a softness that had nothing to do with the storm behind us. "I'm sorry," he said simply. "I'm so sorry I had to make you go through this. But it was the only way." The words did not land like explanation, they landed like a challenge to understand. "Only way," I repeated, as if the phrase needed to be measured out. "Owen, you were buried. The cemetery, the funeral." He nodded once. "I know, and I didn't do it lightly, but I saw what was happening. I saw how they were circling. I needed to see the full thing, to prove intent, to collect it, to stop it before they could take everything. I thought if I disappeared, they'd show their hands faster." He sounded like a man describing a chess move, not a man who had disappeared from life and family. He looked tired. There was a shadow under his eyes, like the kind you get when you've been keeping a secret too long. "How?" The question was a thin iron thing. There were unanswerable parts to burying a person and then walking back into the room. "How did you do this?" He gave me a crooked grin, the same one that had once coaxed me into painting the back porch blue. "With help," he said. "Victor and I planned carefully. There are people who owe favors and a funeral director who's in the habit of, let's call it, flexibility. A doctor who's more interested in the right price than the right report. I know it sounds terrible, but I had to make a story big enough to get them to move. No one thinks of checking behind a grave when they're certain it's sealed." The practical detail of it, callous and absurd, made my head swim. He told me in small, steady waves the sequence. How he had arranged a temporary discharge from the hospital's official chain of identity with a falsified death certificate. A terrible thing, but done by someone who could obscure the paper trail. How a funeral director he'd once helped years before had agreed to hold a closed casket service and then quietly store him away. And how he had slept in a motel on the far side of town for 3 days, changing shirts and shaving every night so anyone who saw him would think he'd been on a long trip. It sounded like a novel, absurd as fate, and yet there he was, warmth in his palm, certainty in his voice. "What about the papers?" I asked. "The recordings, the bank statements, the cards in my name?" He looked at Mr. Dalton and then at Jerome, who had arrived earlier that morning, summoned when Mr. Dalton called, and who now sat very still in the corner. Jerome's face had the legal petrification of someone who knows how to file things irreversibly. "We used those," Owen said. "We let them think the house and money were within reach. We let them feel the possibility. Then we recorded everything, conversations, meetings. We hired an investigator who had eyes in the places we couldn't. When they started to move papers, when they attempted to put things in motion, we had the proof." I remember thinking about the old saying, not every truth needs to be shouted to become true. Sometimes the quiet, ugly things you catch inside a folder are the ones that crumble a life. Michael's face had shifted from shock to anger, then to the unstable blankness people wear when they don't know what comes next. He stumbled through denials that grew thinner with each fold of evidence. Bank withdrawals traced to jewelry stores with receipts in my name, credit accounts opened with my information, checks diverted, mail intercepted. Jerome explained the legal moves quietly and efficiently. Temporary restraining orders, freezes on accounts, emergency power of attorney safeguards placed with the court to prevent any sudden transfer of assets. He advised me to avoid contact, to let the facts breathe and speak, and to let the law do the work of whittling down the truth. But the law is lumbering and procedural, And I had that hungry, wild thing inside, the need to look my son in the eye and understand why. Why would the boy whose feet I had washed when he was small plan for my disappearance like funeral arrangements? Why had he and Harper swapped the word care for the word claim? When I finally asked him, his answer landed with a kind of pathetic honesty. "We were drowning, Mom," he said. "Bills, debt, we thought this might just be a better way. We were scared." His eyes darted to Harper as if she'd provide answers and she simply looked away. "It wasn't about you," he added, as if that were supposed to soften the betrayal. "It was about survival, survival. It had an ache like a bargain you make to yourself in a storm." I wanted to be furious, to say the words that would cut history into two parts, his before and his after. But underneath it all there was a maternal grief that kept returning like a bell, tolling for the child who had turned from custodian to conspirator. Owen's hand tightened around mine. "It's worse than that," he said. "He wasn't just acting alone." Harper's face, which had been playing different shades of civility, had now fallen into an expression that made me think of someone who'd been caught stacking cards on a table of honest hands. "It's different," she said. "We only thought—" "You paid a doctor," Owen interrupted. "You arranged a fake medical assessment that labeled her as having cognitive impairment. You thought legal proof would be the key." Her eyes flashed then, not with shame but with a quick flare of something like hatred. "We were trying to protect her," she said, the words like a lie coated in sugar. "You call fraud protection?" Mr. Dalton's voice was iron. Jerome warmed up to the idea and explained that forging medical opinions and submitting falsified documentation for guardianship or assisted living assessments is not protection, it's a crime. In that hour, the house of our lives seemed to tilt. The legalisms were coming for them, and the moral ones were already present in the room. The tape had done more than capture a plan, it had handed me back a part of myself I thought the world had taken. The freedom to be myself, unbanked by someone else's ledger. Owen had a plan beyond the records. He wanted to force them to choose their next move in public, to make sure every conversation went on record. He'd said earlier, in the quiet way men speak when they're trying on courage, "If they try, we will show the truth." The judge needs to hear their voice saying those words. Still, there was a practical urgency to face. The next weeks would be surgical. Jerome and Victor coordinated to put legal blocks on any change of title, to ensure that no transfer could be made without judicial review. The investigator was going to follow Harper and Michael's moves closely. We were building a net with threads of subpoenas, bank freezes, and recorded testimonies. It felt like preparing for a storm at sea, battening hatches, trimming canvas. But the human work, the one that involved looking at my son and not feeling my heart cave entirely, that was the brutal part. After the initial evidence had settled into stacks on Mr. Dalton's mahogany desk, we walked through what had to be done. "We must be calm," Jerome said. "We must document everything and avoid any confrontation that could be twisted into provocation." For a brief, sacred moment, Owen and I slipped out into the fresh air together. We sat on the stoop of Mr. Dalton's office, the city rushing by in its indifferent, lopsided way. He reached for my hands and held them like someone apologizing to a landscape. "I hated that I had to disappear," he said. "But watching them plan to take you, it made me do things I never imagined." "You could have told me," I said. The sentence had a smallness, but it was a truth. "You made me suffer a funeral." He swallowed, his Adam's apple bobbing. "I thought it was the only way to make them speed up. I thought if I left, they would act faster and make mistakes we could expose. It sounds theatrical now. It was messy and wrong, but it worked." His face was flushed with truth and the fatigue of keeping such a story. I wanted to ask a dozen small questions. Where did you sleep? Who signed the paperwork? How did you handle the look of my friends at the funeral? But words felt thin. Instead, I kissed him, the way two people who have survived a storm touch. It felt like reclaiming a moment of ordinary tenderness in the middle of chaos. We returned to the office where the legal motions started to move like a slow, inevitable animal. Cameras would come, the court system would pull us in, papers would be filed and subpoenas issued. Headlines, perhaps. But for that night, as we walked back past closed shops and the distant hiss of the subway, I found myself humming a small melody Owen used to whistle while he mended the fence. We were quiet companions in a world suddenly raw with exposed truths. He had brought me the proof. He had pulled a curtain and revealed what was hidden. The law could now do its work, but there was something deeper at play, the idea that my life was not a ledger, and that love, however bent and bruised by time, still had the right to choose. When we returned to the office, Michael had left in a hurry. Harper lingered, her composure finally dissolving into something that looked like fear. The investigator's phone buzzed with leads. Jerome drafted emergency filings to the clerk. Mr. Dalton made notes in a pen that looked like it had its own gravity. I felt, for the first time since the sickness of grief began, the small, fierce warmth of being protected. Owen had returned from the impossible to stand with me in the possible. But even as hope fluttered, the air held a new tension. There would be consequences chambered in courtrooms and whispers. There would be betrayals to catalog and legal barriers to build. And most sharply, worst of all, there would be a reckoning with my son. "Are you ready?" Owen asked softly. I looked at him, at the man who had faked his death to save me, and felt the iron and softness of my answer rise up. "No," I admitted, "but I'm not walking away." He squeezed my hand, fierce and forgiving. "Neither am I." We walked back into the office together, the folder between us like a talisman. The recorder sat on the desk, red light blinking like a small heart. Outside, the city moved forward, none the wiser. Inside, our lives shifted into a court of truth. And from somewhere beyond the door, I could hear the distant, thin sound of someone packing a bag. When Owen and I walked into the courthouse for the first time together, it felt like stepping into another country. The marble swallowed our shoes, the air smelled faintly of old paper and bleach. Cameras hovered like curious birds outside the doors, and for a moment I hated the bright, public attention. I'd wanted quiet. Instead, the world wanted spectacle. The filings Jerome had prepared were crisp: emergency motions, temporary restraining orders, requests to freeze accounts and put any change of title on hold. Jerome moved through the system like a man who'd been in battles before, measured, precise, entirely unromantic. He spoke in legal terms that made my head swim, but which, I was told, protected us. Preventative custody, conservatorship injunction, forensic audit. He explained that the recorder, the receipts, the investigator's photos, all of it created a chain of proof we could present. It was the kind of proof a judge couldn't ignore. And yet public procedure is a slow machine. We watched, humbly impatient, as forms were stamped and initials inked, and as a clerk with a bored face told us a hearing would be set in 14 days. 14 days? In the meantime, the county could do a preliminary review and ask the district attorney's office to look into potential felony charges for fraud, elder abuse, and forgery. Jerome said not to expect miracles overnight. He said to expect subpoenas, to expect pushback, to expect theatrics, which is to say, he expected everything. And he was right. Within 48 hours, the family lawyer for Michael and Harper, a slick man in a dark suit who smiled too easily, filed a counter motion. They argued that our requests were harsh and disruptive for a grieving family and that the claims were speculative. They claimed my husband's resurrection itself created credibility problems, a bizarre thing to object to, and yet in his hands it became a cudgel. If the state allowed what they called a theatrical hoax to determine the allocation of assets, where would the law end? It was a performative argument meant to shame us, to recenter the spectacle on Owen rather than the substance of the evidence. The press smelled it. Overnight, there were pieces titled with the sort of sentences internet editors love. Widower returns from the dead, family in turmoil, and elderly widow's family accused of greed. The headlines sounded like theater posters. Journalists called our home, camera crews parked near our mailbox. I had to remind myself that the point wasn't to become a story, it was to stop people from stealing a life. The district attorney's office opened an inquiry. I sat twice with a detective who had kind eyes and a polite manner, and who kept repeating that his job was to look at the evidence and make a recommendation. He asked for copies of journal entries, bank statements, and the investigator's photos. He wanted the recorder's file. He listened to the tape in a way that made whatever was said on it no longer an abstract fear, but a recorded promise of wrongdoing. The DA's office didn't care that someone had faked a death. It cared that, if true, crimes had been committed. 2 weeks later, we were back in court. The judge was a lean woman with a reputation for cutting through nonsense and for making decisions that, while unpopular with the press, tended to be right. She listened with the attention of someone who could smell a lie. Jerome presented the evidence in a way that felt like watching a craftsman lay a mosaic. Each piece mattered, and the larger image emerged only when the light hit it right. Michael's attorney argued the plan was a misunderstanding born of grief. Harper's camp said they had acted prematurely but with care in mind. My son, standing at the defense table, looked smaller than he had in real life. The gravity of the documents pulled the color out of his face. When the DA's representative stood to speak, she did not use theatrical language. She spoke plainly, saying she'd review the investigator's findings and that the tape suggested intent to defraud. "If you plan to pursue criminal charges," she said to the judge, "we will do so based on the evidence." It was enough. The judge approved a provisional freeze on any transfer of assets and allowed the DA to continue investigating. It wasn't a conviction, far from it, but it was a legal girding that meant Michael and Harper could not simply move money overnight, no matter how convincing their arguments. For the first time in weeks, I felt like something other than a sitting duck. That night, the house felt less like a theater and more like a strategy room. We prepared for subpoenas, for the DA's team to interview witnesses, for the private investigator to deliver testimony. Jerome warned us that charges often take time, but that once filed, they can change the course of a life in ways that no afternoon conversation can reverse. The first indictment came not from the DA but from the bank. Forensic auditing revealed multiple suspicious accounts and purchases tied to my information. A handful of credit cards opened in my name and used for jewelry and travel expenses, withdrawals transferred to accounts associated with Michael. It was not missing money that shocked me as much as the audacity of the pattern, tiny betrayals stitched into a larger tapestry of theft. When the DA's office finally charged Michael and Harper with conspiracy to defraud an elder adult, forgery, and identity theft, the headlines changed tone. The public is a fickle audience. It loves a comeback, but it revels in exposure. People I'd known, acquaintances from church, neighbors who'd once waved over fences, they were suddenly either sympathetic or scandal-hungry. Some offered help. Others offered gossip. The cameras filmed the courthouse steps as if it were a stage, and both my husband and I had parts to play. But it wasn't entertainment. It was law. The arraignment was surreal. My son stood in a suit too large for his shoulders, hands clenched by his sides. The magistrate read the charges and then released him on his own recognizance with strict conditions. "You shall not contact the victim," the judge said, a line that felt less like a protection and more like a clean incision between our former life and the one we were entering. He was not allowed near our home and was required to surrender any documents belonging to either of us. Harper, meanwhile, faced professional scrutiny. She had been a licensed nurse, and the allegation she'd conspired with a doctor to produce a fraudulent report spun into an investigation by the state licensing board. That board move could cost her a career and be a public stain no apology could scrub. Legal battles are a strange sort of public theater. There are moments of crescendo. The DA proposes charges, the judge signs an order, and there are hours of grinding paperwork. Subpoenas, discovery requests that require line-by-line accounting of bank statements, affidavits, and expert witness statements. We sat through days of depositions where my son's banker described transfers, where a doctor confirmed he had been paid to write a report he should never have written, where our private investigator displayed photos of Michael at casinos and Harper signing credit card receipts. Each exhibit felt like a blade and a balm at once. It hurt to see the truth laid out, but it soothed the part of me that needed to know. I watched my son through all of it. At times he was blank, at others he tried to look contrite. When a prosecutor played a recording of him on a phone call, the very tape that had set this whole thing aflame, he looked down and swallowed. The prosecutor didn't dramatize. She laid the facts in a steady cadence that made the tape impossible to ignore. The public fallout was swift for Harper. Word of the fake diagnosis spread through small networks and professional channels. Her nursing license was temporarily suspended pending the state board's investigation. The hospital where she had worked confirmed they were cooperating with authorities. The humiliation for her was surgical and immediate. Professional consequences tend to be as cold and brutal as legal ones. For Michael, the consequences took a different shape: criminal charges that carried the risk of probation or worse, and a social ostracization that felt like a slow erosion of identity. My friends organized meals. My church made the coffee and sent cards. Some neighbors came over and stood in my doorway and cried for a while. There was a human kindness that steadied me through the legal machinery. Owen, always practical, handled press questions with a quiet ferocity. "We are not a spectacle," he told a reporter for the local paper. "This is about justice." The prosecution offered a plea at one point. It was the old pragmatic thing the DA does when the evidence is strong but the state prefers a certain economy. Michael's attorneys called to say there was an offer: reduced charges in exchange for guilty pleas on lesser counts and restitution. The deal would keep him from having a felony on his record, but would bind him to a payment plan for the money taken, community service, and strict supervision. It would also require him to publicly acknowledge wrongdoing. The offer hung like a phone call in my hands. I thought about punishment and restoration. I thought about the son who once sat on my lap with scraped knees and a lip split for a pocket of honest adventure. I thought about how justice is not always the same as vengeance. Jerome advised that in cases like this, restitution and accountability can offer a cleaner path for a family to heal, if healing is even possible when trust is cleaved so cleanly. I asked the DA for time to consider. Part of me wanted the fullest punishment. Part of me wanted my son to work and to learn and to be a better man afterward. I wanted to hold him accountable and not watch him vanish into a system that might offer me no narrative of repair. The DA's office respected my input. Victim impact statements weigh heavily in plea decisions. I wrote a letter. I described the particulars: the humiliation of being considered fragile, the small betrayals that had added up, the late-night money transfers that had slowly bled our savings. I asked for accountability that would prevent this harm from being replicated, and for restitution that would put our house and our lives back in some semblance of balance. In the end, a negotiation was reached. Michael pled guilty to a reduced set of charges: 2 counts of identity theft, misdemeanors reduced from felonies in exchange for restitution plans, and 1 count of financial exploitation, a felony reduced to a misdemeanor with terms attached. He was sentenced to 18 months probation, mandatory financial counseling, and ordered to pay restitution on a schedule that Jerome and the DA negotiated. Harper faced professional discipline. Revocation of her license had been recommended, though the final administrative decision would take months. It was not the dramatic fall from grace I had imagined, nor the vindictive retribution that headlines promise. It was, in legal terms, a compromise, a way to bind the fragments back together with some measure of accountability. When the judge read the sentence, Michael's shoulders sank like he had been carrying a weight and had finally set it down. There was no audience applauding. There was only the cracked echo of a gavel and the weight of consequences settling into place. Outside, a line of reporters waited like vultures. I avoided the cameras, my face shielded by a pair of sunglasses. The humiliation had been public, but so too had been the exposure of wrongdoing. Justice, messy as it was, had a public face now. As we left the courthouse, the sky was low and blue, and the world smelled faintly of rain. We walked to the car in a silence broken only by the small, practical things: the click of a seat belt, the rustle of a legal pad. Owen held my hand in the front seat. "We did it," he said quietly. It was true in a way. The law had acted. The important thing was that the law could not be manipulated again in the dark. But even with the legal machinery grinding forward, there were other reckonings left. There would be the civil suits to recoup stolen funds. There would be the board hearings and the professional fallout for Harper. There would be community whispers that would linger like smoke. There would also be a private, quieter reckoning. Could love be repaired when a child had counted the days until a parent's death as an opportunity? As the rain began to fall, thin and steady, I looked out at the street and felt a strange mixture of exhaustion and a fragile peace. The courtroom had done its work, but it hadn't fixed the settled grief or the sense of betrayal. It had only placed the truth where it could be examined. We drove home with the radio playing something gentle. I was tired in the particular way that happens when a person has been holding a storm inside, muscles slackening, the mind settling into a wary, watchful calm. For tonight, the law was on our side. Tomorrow, there would be more forms, more hearings, and the slow, patient labor of rebuilding trust. And somewhere in the quiet corner of my mind, a question seated itself, small and insistent. What happens when the legal storm ends? Who will tend the garden of the life that remains? They told me the courtroom was the hard part. They were wrong. The courtroom was loud and public and efficient in its own way. it served paper and precedent and closed certain doors. The hard part came later in the shape of ordinary mornings and unglamorous chores, when I had to figure out what it meant to live in a world that had been rearranged by greed and then put back together imperfectly by law. The days after sentencing were quieter than I expected. The cameras eased away like tidewater. People returned to their own dramas and the newspaper headlines cooled. I learned quickly that scandal burns hot and bright and then gutters out. What remains is the slow ash that needs clearing. For Owen and me, that clearing began with boxes, the practical business of moving on. We sold the house in the neighborhood that held 40 years of birthdays and arguments and porch lights. The decision was less about the worth of the bricks than the weight of memory. Each room had an echo that tugged like a string, and every string seemed knotted with the past. We could have stayed and tried to reweave what had been torn, but Owen shook his head at one late night, tea-sipping conversation and said, "We need to prune, Ellie. Not out of spite, out of space to breathe." So we found a small place in a town called Willow Bend, 3 hours away from the city and a world that did not know the names splashed on the courthouse steps. It was the kind of small town where the diner knows your order and where people speak to one another over hedges and fences. Our new house had a modest porch and room for a small garden, and when we stood in the yard, the first time I realized how much of my life had been about scaffolding, building walls while my heart grew thin. Moving was both balm and wound. The movers packed our lives with careful hands, tucking away the photo albums that had once been daily altars. We sold the old house and paid down the debts that had been run up in my name. It was a slow, clinical process of restitution, checks, bank orders, legal maneuvers that once again turned intangible betrayal into numbers that could be balanced. Michael's restitution payments began arriving in small, awkward installments, made worse in my mind by the knowledge that they were money he had not earned honestly. He was on probation, required to attend counseling and financial classes. Harper's nursing license was officially revoked after a formal board hearing. She left the hearing room with eyes rimmed in red and a paper bag full of uniforms she no longer needed. The law had done something useful. It had prevented further harm. It had not, of course, repaired the trust shattered between a mother and her son. That was not the kind of thing a judge could fix. It was work of another kind, patient and slow. We arrived in Willow Bend on an overcast morning with boxes in the truck and the smell of fresh paint on our hands. The porch steps creaked in a welcoming way, the neighborhood cats blinked at our unfamiliar faces, and a woman across the lane waved a hand and said, "Welcome. We have a bake sale on Saturday, you should come." The ordinary niceties felt like a kind of mercy. Owen bought roses the first week, not an extravagance, a promise. He bought a small bundle of bare root roses, 9 little sticks with the potential of color and scent crowding their twigs. We dug in the dirt together like people who had been through a storm and still believed in small, stubborn acts of beauty. The earth smelled of loam and rain, and the steady work of planting was a kind of meditation. We placed the roses in a crescent by the porch and tied thin ribbons around them so we could remember each bloom's name. People in town noticed. The local grocer asked about the variety. A girl from the bakery brought an extra loaf and asked if I'd like a lemon bar for the first morning's tea. The simple kindnesses accumulated into a scaffolding of their own, soft and patient, unlike the sudden edifices of city networks and headlines. In Willow Bend, you rebuild quietly and people notice. They say things like, "It's good to see you out in the garden," which is both an observation and an encouragement. There were harder mornings, too. I would wake and the house would be too silent, and for a quick, jagged second the old life would rise up, the way Michael laughed at the dinner table, the way Harper adjusted the napkins as if rehearsing domes of domesticity. Sometimes a noise, the clink of a teacup or the brush of a sleeve, would make me flinch. Other days I'd find the receipts in the drawer and physically remove them, as if a small clearing could speed a healing. Grief and anger and the mundane act of paying bills for our new house were braided together in ways that never seemed tidy. Michael called maybe twice a week at first. His voice had the rawness of a student who knows he has failed and is trying to learn. "Mom," he would say, hesitant, "I'm going to classes, I'm trying to." He used the language of court-ordered rehabilitation and self-improvement. It was not the language of a son who trusted his mother, it was the language of someone trying to repair a ledger. The first few calls ended quickly, which felt safe. Later on, he sent letters, short, awkward statements of apology, sometimes folded with a coupon for a cafe I used to frequent like a peace offering. They read like attempts to purchase absolution. I replied with a narrow honesty. I accepted the restitution and the legal consequences. I asked him to go to counseling and to learn financial responsibility. And I told him that forgiveness, if it ever came, would be earned and slow. People asked me if I'd regret the decision to cut Michael out of our lives. The truth was complicated. There were nights when the silence felt like the absence of an organ, sudden and physical. Other times the relief that pulsed through me felt like oxygen. One late summer evening as Owen and I walked the lane and watched the sunset paint the church steeple in a bruise of orange, I told him, I miss him in the small ways. He nodded. I know, me too. The garden asked for care. It accepted my small, steady offerings, watering, pruning, whispering names to the shoots as if a plant could be coaxed by language. The roses answered with slow, patient blooms. The first bud unfurled like a fist opening into a pink that tasted of apology and the sun. Standing beside Owen as he trimmed away dead wood, I felt my hands learning something simple. To give life where life had been starved, to tend what remained rather than mourn only what was lost. The legal aftermath continued in small bureaucratic ways. There were forms to sign to transfer clear title of accounts, meetings with the financial advisor who helped us rebuild savings in conservative portfolios. Jerome checked in from time to time with a voice that had the steady cadence of someone who had seen families break and had watched fragile rebuilds succeed with patience. He counseled me on how to manage the publicity that still lingered online and on how to navigate the sorrow that never fits neatly into a calendar. Do not let the public story be the whole of you, he said once on the phone. You have a private life to cultivate. And so we cultivated it. We joined a gardening club. They sent over a welcome card inscribed with a pun about roses. We went to the library's book group where a woman named Claire argued passionately about mid-century American novels and made me love reading again with other people. We volunteered on Saturday mornings at the community center where Owen taught a class on basic home repair, showing a roomful of young men and women how to use a level and find the pulse of a house. Sometimes, in the quiet after a hard day, I would take out the recorder Owen had insisted we keep. It was the same make as the one that had recorded Michael's intentions. The hum of it felt strange in my pocket like a small talisman. Sometimes I would play a snippet of his voice, his laughter as he had mowed the lawn, the way he said my name, and the sound would make my throat raw with a strange tenderness. It was not revenge. It was a memory-made thing. The recorder had been an instrument of proof, but in the new life it became a relic of continuity, a small anchor to the man who'd staged his own return to protect me. One afternoon, a letter arrived from Michael. The handwriting trembled. Mom, I'm not asking for forgiveness. I'm asking for the chance to show I can be trusted. I'm in counseling, I'm working odd jobs, and I'm paying back what I stole. I know I've done things I can't fix. I'd like the chance to volunteer at Willow Bend's Community Center. I want to do the hard work. If you say no, I understand. If you say maybe, I'll keep trying. Love, M. I read it twice before I put it in my pocket. Later that week, he came in person for a supervised visit at the community center. He sanded furniture with more patience than I'd ever seen. He moved slowly, as if aware of every step's moral arithmetic. We gave him coffee and let the conversation go like a draft, sometimes warm, sometimes thin. He did not plead. He labored. There is a dignity in labor that no courtroom can grant, and maybe that is where repair begins. Not in apologies, but in sustained, unglamorous effort. Months passed. The roses grew. The town knew our faces but not our scandal. Michael continued to make restitution payments and attended his counseling sessions. Harper moved away. I heard she tried to rebuild her life in another state. The public, whose appetite for drama is quick and forgetful, moved on. In Willow Bend, the small things stitched us into the neighborhood's fabric. The library reading circle invited me to speak about books that got me through grief. Owen taught a class on fence mending. A child next door learned to call us the funny couple with the roses. On quiet nights, we would sit on the porch and count the blooms. You did good, Owen would say, his hand brushing mine. I whispered apologies back for the stretch where I had let mistrust harden like frost, and for the times a mother's love had been complicated and imperfect. Would I forgive Michael entirely someday? I don't know. I think forgiveness is a landscape, not a single gate you walk through. Sometimes I find myself forgiving him in small measures, in the way he shows up at the community center, in the way he reads to the children, in the way he writes letters that do not ask for absolution but for another chance. Other days, memory and anger bloom loud and sharp. On those days, I prune back the parts of me that ache until there is less of a wound and more of a caretaking space. There is a power in surviving a thing that wanted to erase you. The roses we planted were not only for beauty, they were a mark of resilience. They grew from the soil we nurtured together, from the patience of water and the blunt force of pruning shears. They were proof that a life could be reclaimed, not by erasing the past but by tending the present. One morning, as autumn began to settle a quiet gold over the lane, a woman from the church stopped by with a jar of homemade jam. She stood in the yard and looked at the roses. "They look like forgiveness," she said simply. I laughed softly and then thought about the house we had left, the courtroom, the months of paper and testimony, the small poisoning of trust and the long healing afterward. "Maybe," I replied, "or maybe they're only evidence that a thing rooted can bloom again." We stood there, two ordinary people in a tidy town with a tiny garden and a life that had been reassembled into a new shape. The wind lifted the scent of the roses and carried it along the lane. I breathed it in and felt, for the first time in a long time, that the air belonged to us again. If you're reading this and wondering what you would do if it happened to you, when the people who should protect you choose themselves instead, remember this. Truth is slow, but it's steady. The law can help. Community can cradle you. And sometimes, if you're lucky, the person who loves you will do something strange and brave to fight for the life you deserve. We planted 9 roses that spring. They are all different colors now: pale blush, deep crimson, coral. Each one is a small miracle. Each one is a promise. And in the soft light of evening, Owen places his hand over mine and says my name like an answer. "Ellie," he says. "Hello," I reply.